Hi, everyone. So we'll change a little bit the ideal project. In 1938, oh, that's too loud. And it's okay. In 1938, at a conference in Mexico on urban planning, Hannes Meyer talked about the ideal city of Freidorf he built in Basel between 1919 and 1924, but also about other ideal cities by Scamozzi, Piranesi, Weinbrenner, and Le Corbusier. He ended his genealogy with European underground infrastructure. Today, Meyer said in 1938, the Freidorf settlement with its cooperative seminar has become the intellectual center of the Swiss cooperative movement. In other words, of a land in which even the state in the form of the Swiss Confederation is a cooperative. In this respect, it is both instructive and amusing to trace how idealized projects for urban development have changed through the centuries. The ruling social class of the time invariably lurks between these fanciful entities of the ideal city. I will introduce to you the three types of houses present in Freidorf that were completed in 1921 based on Meyer's design. The first type was addressed to the worker family. It had 5 rooms, 2 sleeping rooms, a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen laboratory. It also contained a basement and an unequipped street. The second type had 6 rooms with 1 additional small room on the second floor. It was often rented to employees such as the president and vice president of the settlement cooperative who shared a semi-detached house. The third type was characterized as being even larger with 7 rooms due to the equipped streets and hosted mostly reformers and employees of liberal professions, such as the leaders of the cooperative movement, including the director of the Union of Swiss Cooperatives, the actual commissioner of the project. Cooperative theory places itself in between the economic models of capitalism and communism, and according to the senior leader of the free economy movement in Switzerland, Johann Friedrich Scher, solidarity was key. In fact, the rent of the houses of type 3 was twice about the rent of the house type 1, yet every member of the settlement cooperative had an equal vote in the General Assembly, who decided upon the use of common resources. On this plate, all 3 house types are shown together with 2 additional variations for the second type. Typification on the exterior was maintained for economic reasons. Individual wishes were, however, possible in the interior, and the main difference among the 5 types are related to the increasing size of the rooms, as well as to the shift from a highly efficient circulation to a more generous disposition. For example, the circulation in type 1 follows a straight line between the entrance, the kitchen garden, the cellar, and the laundry. If you see the map, this is the line. Yep. It is a plan enabling the labor of love of a housewife. The third intensive labor of love of a housewife. The internal stairs in type 2, so this one, and this one. However, turn in different directions to enable the addition of a visitor's toilet on the first floor and a vestibule. In type 3, various positions of the several stairs suggest a more choreographed movement, depending on the activity. From the winter garden to the garden, from the side entrance to the hallway, from the hallway to both equipped upper floors, or from the kitchen to the cellar. It is impossible to describe the project of Freidorf without mentioning larger entities than the single house. The site plan dates from December 1919, at the moment when the building site started. One main characteristic is the regional roads, the horizontal axis on the bottom, which became the basis of the plan. Perpendicular to it run 4 parallel streets, and 2 crossing paths parallel to the roads give a quick access to both the main square and the cooperative house. The pattern of circulation is therefore halfway linear regarding the 4 parallel streets and halfway grid, taking into account the overall orthogonal structure. A second characteristic concerns the placement of buildings. An emphasis on the center of the parcel is clearly recognizable, thanks to the large collective building facing the main square, which is very accessible, as well as due to the symmetric disposition on both sides of the main and longest central axis. But the presence of clusters through the mirrored position of the rows of houses is even more prevalent. In fact, 2 opposite logics coexist for both characteristics. The circulation seems both linear and grid-like, while the built substance is both distributed centrally and in clusters. In general, the site plan is very dual in nature. Almost all rows are mirrored. The rows themselves always count an even number of houses, and the absent freestanding house is replaced by a twin house. Also, inside each row, the plan and facades of the houses are mirrored, which creates local centralities within the repetition. For a short comparison, this is a former version of the plan, resembling the scheme by Ebenezer Howard for Garden City. It had been criticized at the Conference of Experts of July 1919. Hans Bernoulli pointed at the fragmentary character resulting from the radial disposition. This is one of the 2 crossing paths with a gathering of children on the grid. The width of this path was 3 meters, while the width of the garden path was half as much, 1.5 meters, and the larger 4 streets were almost twice as wide, namely 5 meters. Here we see the electricity substation, also designed by Meyer, even if it was in the property of an electrical company, with the gates in the background formed by both rows of 4 houses and the garden wall surrounding the settlement. Now I will show you how the 3 types of houses are distributed in the site. And this is a quick picture I did on the archive, so it's a bit distorted. On the axonometric drawing, I marked in red the position of the houses from the 3rd type. They are semi-detached houses on the east mirrored across the central axis, so without facing each other directly, while in the south, 3 of them form their own square. The houses of the 3rd type do not relate to the grid. They are off-centered, and yet they underline or create centrality of by themselves or for themselves. And this is the square on which both families of Johann Friedrich Scher and the architect Hannes Meyer lived side by side. The houses of the 2nd type have 3 variations. They face the main square and therefore the cooperative house, which is here still divided into 2 entities. They also frame the perspective of the 3 elongated residential courtyard on the east, here, there, and in the, and sometimes are positioned at both ends of a row. The distribution evokes a cross as a symbol for the foundation of the settlement, with a central point that coincides with the obelisk, an ornament for the fountain on the square. If houses of the 3rd type are rather like confetti on the eastern periphery, houses of the 2nd type are more central and constitute a kind of grid. These are the semi-detached houses facing the main square, in which live both the honorary heads of the savings and auxiliary funds, as well as the furniture insurance agency of Freidorf, also 2 editors, an electrical engineer, and a librarian. Further on the central axis, these are the rows of 4 houses mixed with houses of the type 1 and also connected with the garden wall. The houses of the first type were the most wanted and therefore in the largest number of 110 on 150. They are situated along the main road. They also form both secondary axis and most of the central axis on its eastern side. And an exceptional single row of 8 houses faces an alley of poplar trees in the direction of Basel. So at this end. The houses of the first type embody the main structure of the settlement, be they the figure of gates along the surrounding wall, or the larger clusters with the mirrored rows of 14 houses. They are inhabited by workers in a shoe factory, warehouse workers, typesetters, bureaucrats, typists, merchants, retail clerks, women, and children. What Meyer called the residential courtyard was the collective space shared by 40 households of 25 by 100 meters, reminiscent of early social housing projects in Spain or France. Beside the shared vicinity, the length of the private kitchen garden was about, again, 25 meters in length and available for private and productive use. On the left, there is a drawing from Leberecht Mige, Everyone Self-Sufficient, Rethinking the Post-War Planning of Settlements from the point of view of gardening with paths, streets, and walls covered by fruit trees and bushes of berries. The settlement of Freidorf was realized in 2 phases. Within 16 months, the 150 houses were completed, which we see here. No communal building is yet realized. Building Freidorf was possible because of the post-war situation, in which umbrella organization of cooperative movements in several countries were appointed by governments to supervise the national food security. Likewise, the inflation boosted the membership of all the Union of Swiss Cooperatives, giving it another political incentive to materialize the power of its alternative economic model architecturally. Economically, the ultimate step to stabilize the growth of cooperative principle was to reinforce its presence in education. The cooperative house was intended to be a center for theory and practice. In 1923, the second building phase started and a single and long communal building was erected. Notably, thanks to the involvement of a newly founded building cooperative called Production, joined by young architecture graduates as an occasion for further training in masonry. By June 1924, the building was inaugurated and the first performance of Theater Coop, organized by Hannes Meyer with comedians from Geneva and artists from Basel and Zurich, took place on the stage of the Assembly Hall. The plan shows 3 different types of entrances. On the east, here, the school entrance surmounted by 2 windows, giving access to 2 classrooms on the first floor and 2 rooms for further training on the second floor. Further up, children access the gymnastic hall. Yes. On the south, facing the square, there is a double entrance to the cooperative shop, one for the shopper and one for the shop holder. Theoretically, of course, both were co-owners of the goods, not the shop holder distributed and the shopper collected. On the west, a vestibule with 4 columns announced the restaurant and the bar. While in the center, a long and relatively narrow staircase leads to the assembly hall of the second floor. We see it well in the section here and in that one up, illuminated by a circular window. In the middle of the roof, a bell tower turned 45 degrees, highlighted as a figure of Janus, the notion of time, which is the god of beginnings, transitions, and endings. Here we see, beside the two daughters of Hannes Meyer, we see the cooperative house. The cooperative shop allows the circular investment of resources, since most goods came from producer cooperatives affiliated to the Union of Swiss Cooperatives, who themselves regulated the distribution of refunds on purchases to consumer association. The school, library, meeting room, and assembly hall were used for educational purposes, but also for further training on cooperative principles. Oh, this is a nice picture I can draw. So, during his lecture in 1938, Meyer used the notion of ideal city. And 19 years earlier, during the early planning phase, as well as publicly at its completion in 1925, he characterized the project and the time from which it emerged as compromise. It may express the same reality, but it also shows the tension at the core of Freidorf. I quote from 1925, "It was 1919, the post-war era, Wilson, agreements for which world history and the zeitgeist compromised themselves equally. And so the village of Freidorf also became a garden city." End of quote. This painting, commissioned in 1924 by Hannes Meyer from Fritz Binden, an artist from Basel, represent both the notion of ideal city and of compromise. Both leaders of capitalism and communism are in direct exchange to develop Freidorf. A caricature of Woodrow Wilson and Lenin is recognizable, which may sound as an ideal situation for the cooperative ideas. The vivid colors may also indicate a utopian register visible in the presence of the engine, while the money bag seemed to reveal a certain critique of the social model of Freidorf. Moreover, the painting was unreal in a more literal sense, as both leaders just passed away in January and February of that very same year. Yet the work of Sbinden also shows a compromise as a direct representation of history. Because of his project for a League of Nations, Wilson received the Nobel Prize for Peace in December of 1919, but the United States never joined that league, which made the principle of self-determination of peoples quite difficult to implement. This is a final depiction, again commissioned by the architect in the context of theater co-op. Sorry for the slightly blurred quality. Again, here it is presented on the wall of the meeting room in Freidorf. It shows a series of portraits of all kinds of workers and employees of the large union of Swiss cooperatives, the different types of inhabitants whom I had tried to house by means of architectural types. I look forward to your questions, and I will conclude with a few words from the portrait of modernity by Robert Musil, which may call question the new condition of workers and employees in the interwar period, gaining a part in the rising middle class, accessing diverse properties through collective organization in a time of economic and social reform. Every man has a function in the state. The prince, the worker, and the artisan are civil servants. Thank you. Sorry.
I get very self-conscious when I speak about swimming.
I'm just breaking the ice, but so thank you for your accurate analysis. And more question, curiosity in a way. I mean, Hannes Meyer saw did he in fact leave? I mean, has he left at a certain moment this this cooperative and went away, or was also present in a more long term? Because in fact, the critics that you have, the tensions that you have raised a bit, I would like to listen to from you how you could also deal them in a more long chronology, because the liberty is always there. I do think that it's always a cooperative, or has it changed? And are there some events that can be maybe interesting to be underlined to enrich a bit the narrative beyond this very short, because in fact you consider a quite short moment, in fact, just to maybe enrich a bit the perspective.
Yeah, it's a maybe the story gets more sad if we take the long perspective. So in the 70s, the first texts were written about the project in the local press, or again written in the local press because they were about to destroy the central building. And now the whole project is protected, let's say. Yeah. But when did he leave? So he left shortly after this painting. Maybe he left after 5 years he spent in the settlement. He also joined the settlement cooperative during the planning. He was not directly part of it because he was not employed by the commissioner, actually. And for most of the people, this was the rule. They only let people that they employed live in the settlement. But he was a kind of consultant of the union. So like the electrical engineer, there were a few exceptions, and like the architect. He left in 1925. And the long chronology of the project, there is a sociological work, a thesis on the whole development of that project. But I would say there is a really strong resistance during the Second World War, again, of that settlement and that model, because all the gardens and even the lawn, the central lawn, becomes a potato field, for example. This is a crisis-resistant project for sure. In the 60s, the Union of Swiss Cooperative definitively leaves the realm of social movements and will become a large enterprise. So now, for example, the housing, it can be described as a housing cooperative, but it is the property of the company. And for example, people are offered a house there instead of a rise of wage. So this is, and it has stayed since the beginning the ultimate property of that company. It was claimed as a autonomous cooperative as a utopian project, but in the legal agreements from the start, it stayed the property of that union of Swiss cooperatives. So yeah, there is a gray zone there. So the criticism he started to make, or the doubt he also expressed with humor, was revealed here not long after. And when the leaders also passed away, maybe. Let's go to, sorry, I looked for the funny, yeah.
Thanks, Stephanie. It was really a really wonderful presentation of a case study that I didn't know personally. I mean, I had heard of, but it's really nice to see you go forensically actually through all the material and focusing on that moment. Although I had the same question, I was very curious to know actually how it evolved. And actually, the fact that you start from this postcard seems very significant. I have to say that I'm really troubled in a good sense by the amount of like Masonic symbolism in this, like, you know, the triangle, the obelisk, the cross. I don't know if this is something that had a meaning behind it or not, but I'm just going to leave that there for one more second. Because if we go back to the question of type, I have not really, I don't know if this is a question more of or a comment, but there are 3 levels at which actually this case study seems to be challenging or pushing us to rethink actually the idea of type. And I would say that they are urban. I would categorize them as urban form, image, and money. I mean, starting from the point of urban form, to me, somehow the urban form or the archetype of the semi-detached house here is more interesting perhaps than the housing typologies inside, because somehow the housing typologies inside, I find it very interesting that you explained that they are basically the same thing, it's just the rooms actually tend to become bigger. I not knowing the case study, I completely trust you because that's exactly what happened actually in domestic developments at this moment in time. The type is set, but what happens is just that if you have more money, you get a bit more space, right? So what is left is the type, or rather archetype, of this semi-detached house that seems to be, to me, really the protagonist of all that. So I find it interesting that in comparison with Tia's example actually this morning, where there was more of a push and pull between inside and outside, here I would say that it's really the slice actually what becomes interesting, right? Rather than going in depth into the bedroom and so on and so forth, is more how the puzzle actually comes together. So that's the first point about the urban form, which would, for me, would question whether the type is the unit or the type is actually the role, rather. Exactly. And that's, I would say that personally, yeah, I agree, actually, it's the settlement. Which brings with it, to me, also a question of terminology. It's a Dorf, but also he calls it a city. So I think that this kind of, moments of friction between, is it a village in a traditional sense? Why doesn't he give a new term to this settlement that is not as traditional as Dorf somehow? I mean, I just find the terminology really interesting because then it projects a different understanding of this urban environment, which leads me to the second point, the image. I find actually the aesthetics of this really striking, right? Because it's kind of relatively conventional for the 1920s, right? If we think about the fact that this is contemporary to, the various Siedlungen, that on the contrary actually had a much more explicitly modernist even actually approach. And if we think about a lot of actually Hannes Meyer's work in the following decades, this is really, really striking. The choice of the pitch roof, for instance, the work that he did with Miguel, who of course actually really was very interested in this rather traditional, if you want, approach. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that question of imagery. And the third point, very briefly, is the question of money, and it's linked to me with the question of image and urban type. I find it very striking that this is trying to propose a kind of ownership or money model that is quite innovative, but that there's no I mean, for a person who doesn't really know the story from outside, it's not so easy to see the correspondence between the cooperative aspect necessarily and the aesthetics or the typology. I don't have an answer for that because I think it's something that a lot of us have tried to do through design studios, actually, to come up with an architecture that corresponds to new ownership models. So, and I don't have an answer for that, but I think that this issue, can type respond to our ownership models, or is type always something that floats on a different level from ownership models? That is a question mark that for me is there. And I'm going to actually pass that on to Brandon, but I'm really curious to know about this aesthetic question of the, the choice of both the imagery, the pitch roof, the Dorf, and so on and so forth. How do you see the traditional element in all that? There was a quote I didn't. He speaks a bit later again about Freidorf in his text that in the time of the Bauhaus in 1928, he writes in general, but many things he says echo with that project still. And one thing he says about the new housing estate, he says it's not characterized by the flat roof or the horizontal and vertical division of the facade, but actually the strong ties with human existence and the organization of all the patterned relationship. So that's, I think, what he was saying there too, for the question of, I don't know if she wants, or if I continue to. Sorry.
Yeah, so the Siedlungen come just after because most of them start the mid-20s, end of 20s, and this is 1919, so it's just before. And his training actually in Germany was really with this end of Jugendstil, neoclassic tradition, but still starting to be more sober, to let go of all the romantic forms, and this was really intentional already here. Yes.
So you would put it more in a test of, let's say, kind of.
Yes, I think some of the facade really comes together just after the war, and the first project of Tat or Tessanova just before the beginning of the war is more or less still the same, and he was also working on similar projects. So yeah. Okay.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot. Sorry, I just wanted to follow up what this point that Maria was saying, in the sense that, and this might explain why Hannes Meyer became, left the cooperative movement, and to a certain extent became also critical of this work, is just because in a way he realized in the 20s that this work belonged to that transition period, which I think he started to perceive maybe as to, not only actually formally, but also politically too traditional, because in the 20s, Meyer becomes a Marxist. And of course, Marxists were critical of the cooperative movement because cooperativism was a compromise, as you said. And Meyer was really being influenced in the 20s by the radical politics of what was happening in the Soviet Union. And so I think that is the reason. I mean, maybe you know more about that, but I have the feeling that in the 20s, while actually he becomes the director of the Bauhaus, he feels like that this kind of involvement in the cooperative movement was becoming a little bit obsolete from his, let's say, own position. And it's actually interesting that then in the late 30s, when he has experienced basically Soviet Union and all the rest, he's in Mexico's, in Mexico during the Cardenas times. He's now going back to the Freidorf, saying, well, that's that's so bad after everything. So I think that there is something very unique about Hannes Meyer. He's a guy who changed quite drastically his own position, and like all good Marxists, he's always like self-critical. I mean, he's always like putting his work under trial, which is also the reason why, unlike many other modern architects, it didn't build this kind of. He was not a good promoter of himself, because he was not like, Le Corbusier or all the others, or Mies, trying to sell this very coherent image. Meyer is actually someone who, on the contrary, really was always reflecting on this past, on these transitions. And Freidorf, of course, is a project that already in the 20s, perhaps he saw as already a thing of the past in his own view, perhaps.
Yeah.
Also in terms of construction, because it seems very heavy masonry, right? So
yes,
it seems like very heavy masonry, and I think something we haven't discussed yet today in terms of type is how tectonics also influence our perception of type, or our idea of type. And I think that definitely, to me, the use of a specific masonry, therefore of a specific type of labor, and so on and so forth, does preordain, let's say, the choice of a specific typological approach, right?
I think there, at many occasions at least, but I don't have proofs, he said that he tried to offer a design that was of a constructivist style, but the commissioner totally rejected it. Also, the fact that it was post-war period, the materials were not available, and the knowledge maybe, or let's say the structure of the companies, local companies, could not really bear with that. So they really also stressed the fact they wanted to build in a way that would stay valuable on the long term, and they didn't know what was the future. Yeah. Yeah.
Stephanie, just the analogy, I think that maybe this transition between the first plan and the second one, because you made an analogy with the scheme of the Garden City, but is it this analogy made by yourself? I mean, because I do not find it so convincing.
Okay.
And I find them so strong, the kind of drawing that in fact put this strong axis within the representation, because there are elements that in fact remain. So this
Yes.
the part where the Meyer and Camarade
The piazza where
live. But yes, is there something which is more related to this entry of the orthodoxical orientation of houses east and west, or not? But there must be somewhere else to me that can be relevant in this transition more than the scheme of the city garden. I do not.
No, it's for me it's interesting because it's too close from the scheme that was under subtitle that it was only a scheme, and that was only a kind of internal joke. I'm sorry. Of course, this was really provisory because the first design from which I don't have any drawing, found any drawing, was actually orthogonal, apparently from what I saw, but it was exactly 90-degree turn from that. I don't have a drawing. And then he said to Bernoulli, yes, I actually tried this orthogonal structure, but I didn't manage to make a convincing design. So I think some people of the future cooperative wish something more romantic, and he tried with a curved street because also there were some issues of traffic, which were solved by something like that, but it didn't. Then the expert expressed and they had to go back to something. It helped him to actually argument to go back to the orthogonal grid. So
because I think he also, for Hans Bernoulli, really the point each time that there was this drawing of Niebuhr, the point was, where can I find the place of this public space that must remain that, and around it maybe the orientation could maybe change in time, but this point of where I put this place, and so it was
actually,
really,
one of the main point of critique was that the position of the main square had no relation geometrically, or like especially to the basis, to the horizontal road, or here horizontal. So the position of it was a bit felt a bit random in that relation.
And then at the same moment, Hannes Meyer was, I don't exactly, but there was also so many drawings of Hannes Meyer of what in English,
Cemetery.
Cemetery. There is a sort of a simultaneity between some drawings of Hannes Meyer and the cemetery, which in fact, in terms of just geometric issues, are quite strong. But,
it's still the same period.
Yeah, just really briefly, because I really enjoyed the presentation as well. I think maybe I've learned I enjoyed the way that you really focused on different aspects of the project, but at the same time, I think I learned a lot more from the answers that you've given, and because I'm not so familiar with Hannes Meyer's work, and so actually, maybe a methodological comment, another way to go about this would actually be to describe all of these compromises that were made during the process of, if that kind of evidence exists, because every one of these sort of moves where there's a compromise in the plan, a compromise in the geometry, a shift from one radial to a more eccentric, and even if that starts happening with the design of the interiors or the arrangement of the housing in relation to each other, I think this would be really revealing, because before that conversation came up, I really wanted somehow, from my understanding, for it to be situated against some of his other work, perhaps. It's another option from just presenting also how the project ends up later. But yeah, it's really great. Thanks.
Thank you.